Welcome once again. This video is the continuation of chapter 10, that is sources of finance. In this today I'll be discussing about the meaning of equity shares, preference shares, the characteristic of equity shares, types of preference shares, the differences and the concept of retained earnings. So let's begin. Equity shares, which is also known as ordinary shares. Issue of share is the most important source of raising long-term finance. The amount of capital to be raised from members of the public is divided into units of equal value. That means a large amount of capital is divided into smaller fragments. Those smaller fragments are known as shares. These units, these small fragments are known as shares, and the aggregate value of share is known as share capital of the company. According to Justice Farewell, a share is the interest of the shareholder in the company measured by a sum of money for the purpose of liability and of interest. Interest over here is dividend. Dividend is the return on investment. A return on investment is the capital which is invested in the form of shares. It also consists of other rights given by the Articles of Association. A share is thus one of the equal parts which the capital of the company is divided. Next, I move on to some of the characteristics. I thought that characteristics are important part. If I explain the characteristics, it will be more clear to you. The holders of equity share are the main risk bearers. They provide risk capital because when the company fails and is closed, equity shareholders lose their entire investment. Second is, equity shareholders are likely to enjoy higher return and increase in the value of their shares. Third, they have a residual claim in the company. The income left after payment of the interest to creditors and the dividend to preference shareholders, the remaining part goes to the equity shareholders. That is why equity shareholders are also known as the share of the last residue. Equity share capital improves the credit worthiness of the company and confidence of the creditors. It is the basis on which loans can be given or can be raised. Fifth is, equity shareholders have the right to elect directors. They can collectively ensure, that means they have a full right to participate in the management of the organization. They can collectively ensure that the company is managed in their best interest. Next, I move on to the preference share. Preference shares are those which carry certain priority rights. First is dividend at a fixed rate is payable on these shares before any dividend is paid on equity shares. Second, at the time of winding up of the company, capital is repaid to preference shareholders prior to the return of equity capital. That is why the name given is preference, because the first preference goes to preference shareholders. Preference shares do not carry any voting rights. However, holders of preference shares may claim voting rights if the dividends are not paid for 2 years or more on cumulative preference share. I think this is clear to you. That means they don't have voting rights in general, but they can claim their voting rights if for consecutive 2 years the dividends are not being paid to them, and 3 years or more on non-cumulative preference share. If it is a cumulative preference share and the dividends are not paid to these preference shareholders for consecutive 2 years, then they can claim for voting rights. And if it is non-cumulative preference share and the dividend is not paid to them for consecutive 3 years or more, then they can claim for voting rights. Preference shares have the characteristics of both the equity shares and debentures. Like equity shares, dividend on preference share is payable only when there are profit and according to the terms of issue. Preference shares are similar to debentures in the sense that the rate of dividend is fixed and preference shareholders do not generally enjoy voting rights. Therefore, these shares are a hybrid form of financing. You can see the chart showing the types of preference share: cumulative, non-cumulative, participating, non-participating, redeemable, non-redeemable, and convertible, non-convertible. Next, we'll discuss about cumulative preference share. When dividends go on accumulating, if they are not paid, preference shares are said to be cumulative. If due to some reason dividends in a particular year are not paid, they will be carried forward to the next year. Such unpaid dividends go on accumulating and become payable out of profit in the subsequent years. Any dividend can be paid to equity shareholders only after payment of such accumulated dividends on preference shares. They are always cumulative unless otherwise stated. Next is non-cumulative preference share. On this type of preference shares, dividend is, if unpaid, are not carried forward or do not accumulate. If the company is unable to pay dividend in a particular year, the shareholder's right to dividend in respect of that year is lost. So it doesn't carry forward to the next year. Next is participating preference share. These shares carry a right to share in the surplus profit left after a fixed dividend is paid on both equity and preference share. That means the dividend is first paid to preference shares, the left out dividend is paid to equity, the remaining dividend is paid to the equity shareholders, and after that also if some amount is left out of profit, that is known as surplus. So these shareholders, participating preference shareholders, they get the amount out of that surplus profit. In addition to a fixed rate of dividend, the holders of such shares get a part of residual profit. Non-participating preference shares, such preference shares carry a right of only a fixed rate of dividend and do not give their holders a right to share in the residual profit of the company. Redeemable preference share. These preference shares can be refunded either on the expiry of a specified period or at the option of the company. The Companies Act has laid down that preference shares must be repayable within 20 years from the date of issue. So they have a lifespan of 20 years. They must be repayable within that stipulated time. Irredeemable preference shares, such shares are refunded only at the time of winding up of the company. They are not paid up during the lifetime of the company. Convertible preference shares, holders of these shares are given the option to convert their shares into equity shares after a fixed period. So they have an option. If they don't want to be a preference shareholder, they can convert their share into equity. But it should be done after a fixed period. Non-convertible such shares cannot be converted into equity shares. Move on to the distinction between the equity and preference shareholders or shares. The first difference is based on the nominal value. The nominal value of equity shares are generally low, and the nominal value of preference shares are generally very high. Second is right to dividend. After preference dividend is paid, that means I told you earlier also, equity shareholders are the holders of the last residue. So after the dividend is paid to the preference shareholders, whatever is left out, it is being paid to the equity shareholders. Priority over equity shares. Third is refund of capital after preference shares are paid, and preference shares are given priority over equity shares. Rate of dividend, it fluctuates with the profit in case of equity shares, and in preference shares it is generally regular and fixed. Equity shareholders or equity shares, they have full voting rights, whereas no voting right except when dividends are unpaid for 2 or 3 years. Next is degree of risk. It sink and swim with the company, and preference shares, they have relatively less risk. Redemption, not repayable during the lifetime of the company in case of equity shares, and in case of preference shares may be redeemed after a fixed period or at the option of the company. Appeal, attractive to bold and adventurous investors, those who love to take a higher degree of risk. For them, equity shares are more suitable, and preference shares appeals to conservative and orthodox investors who are generally expecting a higher rate of return on their investment. So that goes to preference shares. Next, I move on to the concept of retained earnings. Reinvestment of undistributed profit. Undistributed profit means the profit which is not distributed in that particular year. So that profit, the amount of that profit is reinvested. It is a very good source of business finance. Retained profit refers to the profit which have not been distributed as dividend but have been kept for use in the business. Profits are usually retained in the form of general reserves. A part of the profit is transferred to the reserve every year. After a few years, it becomes large amount which is then employed for modernization, expansion. That means when it becomes large amount as reserve, then that amount is used for the expansion of the business, for the modernization of the business, for setting up of technologies in the business. Retained profits are also known as plowing back of profit, self-financing. That is not borrowed from others. It is self-financed or internal financing. As the retained profit belong to the shareholders, they are considered ownership funds. So retained profits are also known as ownership funds. So I hope whatever I have explained today is absolutely clear to you. To make it more clear, please read your textbook. I'll get back to you in the next class. Thank you and have a nice day ahead.